안녕하세요.
The morning breeze gently swept over the vast rice fields, carrying the sweet aroma of wildflowers. The sun rose lazily over the horizon, casting golden hues upon the small village nestled in the South Korean countryside. Song Hye-kyo, dressed in a simple hanbok, walked through the fields, holding a basket filled with herbs she had gathered at dawn. Life in the countryside was all she had ever known, and despite its hardships, there was an undeniable peace in this place. Then, the distant rumble of a car engine shattered the tranquility. A sleek black sedan, the latest model, slowly made its way down the dirt road, standing in stark contrast to the rural landscape. In the back seat, Park Jimin gazed out at the scenery with a distant expression. He hadn't set foot here since childhood, when his parents still allowed him to visit his grandparents, without the rigid rules that now governed his life. The fresh air of the village felt like a distant memory, something he had almost forgotten amid the business meetings and lavish parties of Seoul. The car came to a stop in front of the small wooden house where his grandparents lived. Jimin stepped out, adjusting the expensive overcoat draped over his shoulders. The moment his feet touched the ground, a muffled sound caught his attention. When he turned, his eyes met a familiar figure, a young woman, with a surprised expression. Her basket dropped at her feet. Song Hye-kyo stared at the visitor with a mix of shock and disbelief. She remembered him not just as the grandson of the elders she deeply respected, but as the boy who, years ago, used to run through these fields by her side. The same boy who at some point had stopped coming back. "You?" Her voice came out hesitant, as if she feared that saying it out loud would make him vanish like a ghost from the past. Jimin blinked, taking a moment to respond. He recognized those eyes instantly. They were still the same despite the years that had passed. Song Hye-kyo? Her name escaped his lips like a whisper laden with memories. The silence between them was broken by the soft laughter of Jimin's grandparents, who had stepped outside to greet him. "Ah, so you remember each other." Jimin's grandmother smiled, approaching Song Hye-kyo. "She takes such good care of us, dear. She always brings natural remedies and helps with the crops." Jimin nodded slowly, but his mind was still trapped in the past. What Hye-kyo didn't know was that this reunion was no coincidence. He had returned to the countryside against his father's wishes, seeking refuge from the suffocating world of business, and perhaps something he himself couldn't quite name. Song Hye-kyo knelt to pick up the fallen herbs, avoiding Jimin's gaze. But before turning to leave, she murmured something almost inaudible. "You should have never come back." Her eyes glimmered for a fleeting moment before she disappeared into the fields. Jimin remained still, watching her go, feeling a strange weight settle in his chest. He wasn't sure why her words affected him so much, but one thing was certain: this would not be the last time they met. The wind blew gently through the rice fields, making the leaves dance to a silent rhythm. The village continued its peaceful routine, but inside Jimin, a storm was brewing. He couldn't forget the look in Song Hye-kyo's eyes, nor the words she had spoken before disappearing. "You should have never come back." Why? What had been left behind? During dinner, his grandparents spoke animatedly about the village, the neighbors, and the recent harvests, but Jimin could barely touch his food. His gaze lingered on the half-open door, where the wind carried the scent of damp earth. He felt an emptiness that needed to be filled, a missing piece in this puzzle. That night, the moon hung high in the sky as Jimin stepped outside to get some fresh air. His feet instinctively led him to the river, where so many memories of the past remained. And there she was, sitting by the water's edge, staring into the river with a distant expression. The moonlight reflected off her dark hair, and her face held a mix of nostalgia and pain. "You always liked this place." His voice broke the silence, but it didn't startle Song Hye-kyo. She didn't turn to face Jimin, only continued gazing at the water, as if searching for answers there. "Not everything has changed." Her voice was quiet, yet it carried something indefinable, a melancholy tone that made Jimin wonder what else was hidden behind it. He hesitated before sitting a few steps away from her. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken memories. "What happened to us?" he asked, without pretense. Song Hye-kyo finally looked at him, Her gaze was intense, but also full of pain. "You left, Jimin. You never looked back." He opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. She continued, "After you left, I waited. I waited for a letter, a message, any sign that you still remembered me. But all I got was silence." Jimin felt a tightness in his chest. He wanted to say that it hadn't been an easy choice, that his father had taken him away from this place and forced him to forget any connection to the countryside. But he knew that excuses weren't enough. "It wasn't easy for me either." His voice came out lower than he intended. "My father never gave me a choice. He decided my future, my entire life." Song Hye-kyo let out a bitter laugh. "But you accepted it, didn't you? You became the perfect son, the flawless heir." Jimin lowered his head, feeling the weight of guilt. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but being here in front of her made everything feel even more painful. "I never forgot you," he said suddenly. Song Hye-kyo held her breath for a moment, but quickly shook her head. "Words are easy, Jimin, but time doesn't go back." He didn't know what to say. The silence between them was filled only by the sound of the river flowing. Jimin sensed there was something more, something she still wasn't telling him. But now wasn't the time to press her. "Can I at least try to make things right?" he asked sincerely. Song Hye-kyo watched him for a long moment before standing up. She dusted off her dress and sighed. "Some wounds don't heal so easily." And with that, she walked away, leaving Jimin alone by the riverbank. The cold wind blew against him, a reminder that the past was still unresolved. And deep down, he knew that Song Hye-kyo was hiding something deeper than simple resentment, something he was determined to uncover. Jimin stayed there for a while, looking at the water, trying to find answers in the moon's reflection. He closed his eyes for a moment and remembered the times they had laughed together on this very shore, when the future still seemed like a promise full of possibilities. But now, all that remained were memories and a chasm between them that he didn't know how to cross. That night, as he returned to his grandparents' house, Jimin made a silent vow. He wouldn't leave without understanding what had truly happened. And more than anything, he wanted to prove to Song Hye-kyo that there was still something between them, something strong enough to defy fate. Dawn broke over the village with the sound of birdsong and the fresh scent of morning dew hanging over the fields. Jimin had spent the entire night awake, his thoughts consumed by Song Hye-kyo's words. Something inside him screamed that there was still much left unsaid between them. But how could he break the barrier that time and pain had built? That morning, he went downstairs for breakfast and found his grandparents smiling as always. His grandfather, ever observant, noticed his distant gaze and with a playful tone said, "You look like a man who's seen a ghost." Jimin forced a smile, but his grandmother simply looked at him with warmth and placed a bowl of hot porridge in front of him. "Sometimes certain people return to remind us of what we left behind," she said gently. Later, as he walked through the village center, he spotted Song Hye-kyo at the market, talking with some of the villagers. Her smile was warm, but when her eyes met his, there was a flicker of surprise, followed by an unmistakable coldness. She turned away and continued her conversation as if nothing had happened. Determined not to let it slide, Jimin approached. But before he could say a word, a young man stepped between them. "Hye-kyo, will you be helping with the preparations for the festival tonight?" the young man asked eagerly. She smiled and nodded. "Of course, I'm in charge of the decorations." Jimin felt an unexpected pang of irritation at how effortlessly she interacted with everyone else, as if he were nothing more than a stranger. "You should come too," the young man suggested, turning to Jimin. "It's a great opportunity to learn more about the village." Song Hye-kyo glanced at him quickly, waiting for his response. Jimin could tell she didn't want him to accept, and that was all the reason he needed. "Of course, I'll be there," he answered, locking eyes with her. The festival began at dusk, with lanterns lighting up the streets and laughter filling the air. Jimin arrived and searched for Song Hye-kyo, eventually finding her arranging decorations, focused on tying small lights around the village's central pavilion. As he approached, she pretended not to notice him. "Need any help?" he asked softly. She hesitated for a second before responding. "No, I'm fine." Jimin picked up a strand of lights and helped string them up anyway. Song Hye-kyo sighed but didn't argue. For a moment, the silence between them wasn't as heavy as before. "It seems like you're fitting in well," she commented, still not looking directly at him. He gave a small smile. "Or maybe I'm just trying to get close to you again." Song Hye-kyo paused for a moment, pressing her lips together. But before she could reply, an unexpected rain began to fall, sending people scrambling for shelter. Jimin and Hye-kyo stood frozen for a second, rain soaking them as they stared at each other, caught in a moment that felt like an intersection between the past and the present. She blinked, snapping back to reality, and hurriedly stepped away. "Good night, Jimin," she murmured before disappearing into the crowd. He remained there, feeling the water run down his face. But unlike the past, this time, he wouldn't let her slip away so easily. The rain from the previous night left a fresh scent lingering over the village, and the leaves still glistened with tiny droplets of water under the morning light. Jimin hadn't been able to sleep. He replayed every detail of Song Hye-kyo's expression in the rain, her hurried escape, and the unspoken words that hung between them. He decided he could no longer ignore the past. If there was something Song Hye-kyo was hiding, he needed to know. And deep down, he feared that whatever it was might change everything. By late afternoon, he found her near the village barn, stacking sacks of rice. When she saw him, her expression hardened. "What do you want, Jimin?" Her voice was firm, but there was an unmistakable emotional exhaustion beneath it. He didn't hesitate. "I want you to tell me the truth. What happened after I left? Why do you look at me like that, as if you want to push me away but at the same time can't?" Song Hye-kyo closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to answer. When she met his gaze again, her expression carried years of repressed pain. "You want the truth? Then listen carefully. When you left, it wasn't just your absence that remained. Your father made sure we never had contact again. He destroyed the letters I wrote to you. He told me it was better to forget you because we would never belong to the same world." Jimin's heart pounded. The thought that his father had deliberately erased any trace of their connection filled him with a silent, simmering rage. But Song Hye-kyo wasn't finished yet, and he didn't stop there. Her voice wavered slightly. "My family went through difficult times after that. My father fell ill, and the hospital bills were overwhelming. Your family could have helped us, but they didn't. We almost lost everything, Jimin." A sharp pain tightened in Jimin's chest. He had never known any of this. He had spent years under the illusion that Hye-kyo had simply forgotten him when, in reality, she had suffered because of his absence. "I didn't know. I never knew." His voice was barely a whisper. "But now you do." She held his gaze, unwavering. "So what are you going to do about it, Jimin? Because I spent a long time learning how to live without you." Silence settled between them, heavy and full of emotion. Jimin felt like everything had changed in that instant. Now that he knew the truth, he couldn't just ignore it. But he also knew that winning back Song Hye-kyo wouldn't be simple. "I wish I had been here. I wish I could have helped you." Jimin took a step closer, but she instinctively took a step back. "And now, I want to fix this." Hye-kyo let out a laugh, but it wasn't a happy one. It was bitter, the laugh of someone who had expected that answer. "Fix it?" Her eyes shone with a mix of emotion and irony. "Do you think money can erase the years I spent suffering? That it can change what happened? I'm not talking about money, Hye-kyo. I'm talking about us." The wind blew between them, carrying dried leaves into the air. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. But Hye-kyo only closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "It's too late, Jimin." She turned to leave, but instinctively he reached out and gently caught her wrist. The moment he did, she froze. Even that brief touch carried years of unspoken emotions. Realizing this, he quickly let go, remembering the promise he had made to himself to respect her space. "Please, don't push me away again," he said softly. Hye-kyo hesitated, but she didn't reply. Without another word, she continued walking, leaving Jimin standing there, certain that this story was far from over. Now that he knew the truth, he had a new purpose: to confront his father and reclaim the time that had been stolen from them. Night had fallen over the village, bringing with it the sharp chill of autumn. Jimin couldn't shake off the weight of the truth he had uncovered. The wind whistled through the trees, but nothing could quiet his mind. He knew he had to confront his father, but he also knew he had to regain Song Hye-kyo's trust. That morning, he made his decision. He took the car and drove to Seoul. His heart pounded as he passed through the grand gates of his family's imposing mansion. Inside the vast hall, his father, Park Min-jun, was waiting for him, his gaze as cold and calculating as ever. "You came back sooner than I expected." The patriarch's voice echoed through the room. Jimin took a deep breath. "I know what you did to Hye-kyo and her family. I know you made sure none of her messages ever reached me. I know they struggled while you deliberately ignored them." His father remained impassive, watching him. "And what do you intend to do with that information?" "Cut ties with you," Jimin said firmly. "I don't want your inheritance. I don't want to be part of your dirty empire." Park Min-jun frowned, a rare flicker of surprise crossing his face. "You're really willing to throw everything away for her?" "I'm willing to choose my own happiness, something you never knew how to do." Jimin's father studied him for a long moment before finally sighing. For the first time, the coldness in his expression wavered. "If that's your decision, I won't stop you. But know this, I never intended to destroy her. I only wanted to ensure you followed a safe path." Jimin shook his head. "Your path was never safe for me." Without another word, he turned and walked away from the house, feeling lighter than ever. Now he had only one thing left to do: return to Song Hye-kyo and prove that he was willing to stand by her, no matter what. Back in the village, he found her near the bridge where they had first met as children. She seemed lost in thought until she sensed his presence. "You came back," she said, her voice carrying restrained emotion. "And I'm here to stay," Jimin replied, taking a small step forward. "I cut ties with my father. I refused everything. There's nothing keeping us apart anymore." Song Hye-kyo's eyes shimmered, but hesitation still lingered within them. "Why now, Jimin? What changed?" He gave her a soft smile. "I changed. I realized that wealth means nothing if I can't share my life with you. I want to be here. I want to build something with you." Song Hye-kyo averted her gaze, biting her lips. He knew it wouldn't be easy to convince her, but he also knew that this time he wouldn't give up. So he simply extended his hand to her, waiting. For a long moment, she remained silent, but then, with a deep sigh, she finally took his hand. Jimin smiled. He knew their story was far from over, but for the first time in years, he felt like they were finally on the right path. The rising sun painted the sky in golden and orange hues, reflecting over the lake beside the village. The air was crisp, carrying the fragrance of wildflowers and the lingering morning dew on the grass. Jimin and Song Hye-kyo walked side by side, their steps slow on the soft earth. Her hand, still entwined with his, was a silent sign that something had changed. But there was something left unsaid, something hanging between them like a fragile thread about to break. "Jimin." Song Hye-kyo finally broke the silence, her voice soft but laced with hesitation. He looked at her, noticing the conflict in her eyes. For a moment, he feared what was coming next. "I'm still scared," she admitted, shifting her gaze to the horizon. "All of this happened too fast. You left everything behind for me, but what if one day you regret it?" Jimin stopped, gently pulling her so she would face him. "I won't regret it." His voice was firm, but his eyes were filled with warmth. "I've spent too long living by other people's rules. Now, I want to live my own life. With you." She sighed, her expression softening. But there were still doubts, fears that couldn't be erased with words alone. "Then, what do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jimin smiled slightly and looked toward the lake. Their reflections danced upon the still water, as if fate was offering them a second chance. "We start over. No rush, no pressure, just being who we are." Song Hye-kyo finally smiled, and in that moment, Jimin knew he had made the right choice. It didn't matter how long it took, he was willing to wait. The wind blew gently, carrying away the doubts of the past. They didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, they had each other, and that was enough. As they walked back to the village together, Jimin lightly squeezed Song Hye-kyo's hand, a silent promise that he would never let her go again. A few days later, Jimin sat with his grandparents, who greeted him with joy and pride. "So, you've made your decision?" his grandfather asked. his eyes gleaming with curiosity. "Yes, I'm staying here. I want to build something alongside Hye-kyo and help the village." His grandparents exchanged knowing glances, satisfied with their grandson's choice. The small village, which once seemed so distant from his luxurious life in Seoul, was now his home. That evening, a festival lit up the village with colorful lanterns and laughter. Jimin and Song Hye-kyo strolled between the food stalls, greeting the neighbors. Children ran around them, laughing and playing, and for the first time in a long while, Jimin felt truly at peace. Hye-kyo paused in front of a tree covered in red ribbons tied to its branches. A village tradition said that those who wrote their wishes on a ribbon and left it there would have their dreams come true. Jimin watched as she picked up a ribbon and wrote something before tying it to a branch. "What did you wish for?" he asked curiously. She smiled playfully. "If I tell you, it won't come true." He chuckled softly, taking his own ribbon. With a serious expression, he wrote down his own wish and tied it beside hers. When Hye-kyo tried to peek, he quickly hid it. "You can't see mine either." She laughed, and for that moment, everything felt perfect. The village bells rang in the distance, marking midnight. Their new beginning was just getting started.
You're my eternity.